This video is brought to you by Skillshare. It's now been a couple of years since we saw the first signs of stress in the Chinese economy, with the slowdown in the property sector in 2020 and then Evergrande's default in late 2021. Since then, the property crisis has spiraled into the wider economy, with stress showing in basically every sector, with little immediate prospect of relief for the CCP. So, given that we've had months of bad headlines for the CCP and things don't seem like they're going to get better anytime soon, we thought we'd try to fast forward and take a look at the 3 ways that China's economic crisis might finally end. Spoiler, only one of them's good. So, before we get into the solutions, a quick recap on the nature of China's economic crisis. As we've detailed in previous videos, China's economic crisis is fundamentally about its lack of domestic consumption. If you want to know more about this, then we'd recommend this book. But the TLDR is that essentially GDP is usually defined as the sum of 4 things: government spending, business investment, net exports, and domestic consumption, i.e. spending by private households. In most of the world, consumption makes up something like half of GDP, but because a variety of mechanisms allow China to essentially underpay its workers, in China that number falls to just a third. All of China's disparate mini-crises are in some way related to this fact. The deflationary crisis, for example, is a symptom of the fact that Chinese households just don't have enough disposable income. Similarly, the property crisis is so acute because impoverished Chinese households have to take out lots of debt to get on the housing ladder. China's export crisis is particularly acute because Chinese manufacturers can't sell to their domestic market, because, again, Chinese consumers don't have enough money. China's local government debt crisis emerged because Chinese consumers just aren't economically active enough to actually make productive use of local government's big infrastructure projects, like high-speed rail or massive bridges, which means they don't produce higher tax receipts to pay off the debts. China's youth unemployment crisis is in part a story about educational inflation, but it's also because, as exports decline, China's domestic economy doesn't have the strength to create enough jobs. In this light then, there are basically 3 things that could happen next to the Chinese economy. 1. China could fail to rebalance its exports towards consumption, which would either mean a rising trade surplus or more debt. 2. China could reduce its exports and investment, which would increase consumption as a percentage of GDP, but incur a recession. 3. China could increase consumption without significantly reducing exports or investment, which is economically optimal but politically difficult. So let's start with option 1. Just keep doing what they're already doing and keep consumption low. In practice, this would improve using stimulus to support the property sector and local governments, and continue to suppress wages in order to nurture Chinese exports. For this to work, though, China would need to find new export markets to replace its domestic demand and buy up its products. Unfortunately for the CCP, the reverse is true. As the rest of the world gets more protectionist and more suspicious of China's distortionary trade practices, it has fewer export markets, which means more debt. Essentially, if Chinese companies can't find new sources of demand, foreign or domestic, then continued investment and exports can only be funded by borrowing more money. While this might sound like the easiest option in the short term, this is clearly not an ideal outcome from the CCP's perspective, who've made it clear that they want to resolve China's rising debt burden. Even if these rising debts don't result in a full-on debt crisis, they'd still become a significant drag on China's economy after a while. Option 2 is to decrease exports and investment. Even if Chinese households didn't get any richer, this would still make consumption a higher fraction of GDP. Because if the other components of GDP get smaller, then consumption accounts for a larger percentage. Obviously, this would be a pretty terrible outcome, because a drop in GDP would mean, well, a recession. But chances are China's economy would be more balanced afterwards. This is what would happen if one of China's many crises escalated into a full-on financial crisis, and would be structurally similar to what happened to America in the 30s with the Great Depression, or what happened to Japan with the lost decade in the 1990s. At the moment, this looks unlikely because the CCP have so far been able to keep a lid on things, but it can't be ruled out because, well, financial crises are rarely foreseeable. Option 3 is to increase consumption without significantly reducing investment or exports. This would be the economically healthiest option, but it would be politically difficult for a couple of reasons. For starters, even if it doesn't incur a recession, because China's rapid growth has historically been generated by big growth in exports and investment, this structural rebalancing will almost definitely mean a temporary economic slowdown, which the CCP won't be so keen on. The CCP likes setting ambitious GDP targets for political reasons, and they'll be reluctant to accept lower growth rates, even if it's still growth and the right thing to do for the long-term health of the economy. But perhaps more importantly, increasing consumption will mean transferring wealth away from key constituencies like exporters, property developers and local government, and towards households and workers. And this is the main reason that, historically, rebalancing has proved difficult for many export-driven economies. The constituencies that benefit from the current economic model become economically and politically powerful, and then they resist the needed structural changes for self-interested reasons. To give a more concrete example, imagine you run a big Chinese manufacturing company. You've made a lot of money by essentially underpaying your workers and using China's undervalued currency to sell your manufactures to customers in America and Europe. If the CCP try to make you pay your workers more to increase private consumption, you're not going to be happy, and something similar is going to be true for developers and local governments. In a sense, this shouldn't come as a surprise. China has spent the past 5 decades creating and nurturing its export-led growth model. Unwinding this and shifting towards a more consumption-focused economy was always going to be a gargantuan task. Ultimately, the fundamental problem for China is that consumption makes up too small a fraction of GDP. Unfortunately for the CCP, even if they understand the problem, rebalancing won't be easy, however they decide to do it, and tough times lie ahead. A few weeks ago, we told you that we were making a physical newspaper, but it turns out that designing a newspaper isn't all that easy. So we headed to Skillshare to take their course on the topic. Unlike when Jack tried to learn InDesign for another never-released project a few years ago, this time he was guided through the process quickly and efficiently. And this time the project will actually see the light of day thanks to Skillshare's incredibly easy-to-follow guides. In fact, here's an exclusive little preview of what we've been working on. It's not just that either. You likely already knew Skillshare for classes and things like photography, editing and illustration. But did you know that Skillshare also has hundreds of career-focused classes too? That's courses on everything from how to start a business to maximising your workflow or how to grow in e-commerce. Another course that Jack's taking to help him with the newspaper. And if you use our link, then you can get access to all of that for free. That's right, the first 500 people to use our link will get access to one of Skillshare's best offers. 30 days free and 40% off your first year of Skillshare membership. That's the best Skillshare offer we've ever had, so make sure you click our link in the description. Thanks for your support and to Skillshare for sponsoring this video.